History tends to focus upon single individuals far more than it should. This obsession with specific figures has led to a great deal of problems in the modern world. History becomes skewed when viewed simply from the perspective of one person. Their actions and intentions can become twisted by contemporary knowledge and opinions. The danger is that people in the modern world begin idolizing individuals after learning about only a few of their actions, and fail to recognize or acknowledge others. When I began this extend research project into the life and legacy of Peter the Great of Russia, I was wary of these pitfalls. I did not want to focus on the single personality. I wanted to show and prove how dangerous that can be. I wanted to use Peter the Great and his legacy as evidence of why celebrating historical figures without proper context leads to bad history. Peter the Great is remembered as great, but the smallest bit of research reveals that he perhaps does not deserve this title. I wanted to shed light on how Peter's legacy overshadowed the suffering of the common people in Russia. However, as I researched deeper and deeper into Peter's life and personality, I started to understand why such a cult of personality had been built around this individual. He was not great and should not be remembered as such. However, he was extraordinary, and that is what many contemporary historians and individuals get wrong. They blur the line between fascination and idolization. Idolization leads to an abandonment of proper facts and neglect for proper context. In the case of Peter the Great, idolization by historical and contemporary individuals has led to his undeserved title. That is the fine line to be tread when embarking on this project, to not let any sort of idolization come from my fascination with this individual and with Russia at the time, because that would lead to improper assumptions, a bias, and a neglect for proper history. However, he was so impactful on the development of modern Russia that all my previous intentions to downplay the focus on singular individuals in history were thrown out of the window, because I believe Peter was not simply another royal who was remembered in history simply because of his royal blood. He deserves the fame he has, however he does not deserve the reputation he's been given. So why Peter the Great in the first place? I felt he was one of those well-known figures that were not well known. By that I mean many people were aware of his existence. There are many statues of him in Russia and around the world. He is in media and entertainment, but most people who know him only know about his most famous and positive achievements. I was one of those people until I read The Romanovs by Simon Sebag Montefiore, an excellent book that details the lives of the entire Romanov dynasty from Michael I in 1613 until Nicholas II and the end of the Tsars in 1918. When I got onto the section on Peter the Great, I knew of his existence, but was both shocked and intrigued by everything that is less well known about him and his reign. Recent events regarding statues of historical figures in UK, Europe, and America made me realise that similarly to how figures such as Winston Churchill and Sir Thomas Picton were celebrated as national heroes without most knowing of their other far less savoury exploits, Peter the Great is also widely celebrated and commemorated in Russia and around the world with little attention given to whether he actually deserves the praise that history has given him. First, I want to try and convey the kind of person that Peter was, as this will give the best insight into whether or not he deserves to be celebrated in history, or just simply remembered. Peter the Great was born on the 9th of June 1672. The product of his father Alexi's second marriage meant that by all accounts, he was never destined to be Tsar. His half-brother Fyodor III came to the throne in 1676, and that was supposed to be the end of it. He would rule and then his eventual son would. However, in 1682 he promptly died and a succession crisis ensued. The Boyar Duma chose Peter to succeed Fyodor, despite the fact that under normal succession rules, Peter's half-brother Ivan, the younger brother of Fyodor, would take the throne. However, Ivan was chronically ill and mentally disabled, which made the Duma choose Peter as Tsar. The events that followed are known as the Moscow Uprising of 1682, where Ivan's sister, Peter's half-sister, Sophia, led a coup with the help of the elite military corps known as the Streltsy against Peter and the Duma in order to secure Ivan as Tsar. The Moscow Uprising is thought to have had a great impact upon Peter as a person, due to the fear that he lived in for many months, and the executions and murders he was forced to witness by the Streltsy. He was only 10 years old when he witnessed one of his father's most trusted advisors and friends, Matveev, being dragged away from him and thrown onto pikes, where he was dismembered and thrown onto a huge pile of other body parts in the centre of the Kremlin. There is evidence to suggest this caused lasting mental damage on the young Tsar. Throughout Peter's life, he suffered from nervous twitches and epilepsy. He couldn't keep his mouth or nose still and would involuntarily roll his eyes back, giving him a deranged look. It isn't fully known what caused this, and it could very well have simply been genetic, but the most probable answer is that it was because of the mental trauma caused by the Moscow Uprising when he was such a young boy. The Moscow Uprising ended with a compromise between Sofia's Streltsy allies and the Boyar Duma. Ivan and Peter would become co-monarchs under the supervision of Sophia as regent due to Peter's young age and Ivan's mental disability. This is the second event in Peter's early life that helped shape the person he was. Ruling side by side with Ivan may seem like a poor compromise that neither side liked. However, Peter was in some ways grateful for the opportunities this granted him. Ivan, with his more impressionable and weaker mind, took up all the traditional religious and ceremonial duties that until then all Russian Tsars had been expected to take part in. This left Peter time to indulge the many curiosities and hobbies that he wanted to. These childhood wonders were the beginning of much larger things for Russia. Peter had many hobbies, from carpentry to astronomy to playing soldiers, but his favourite was sailing, and it was this love of sailing that led to one of Peter's most well-known reforms, or rather creations, the Russian Navy, as before Peter, one had not existed, so there was nothing to reform. The events surrounding how Peter found his first boat, the St. Nicholas, one summer in Izmailov, have become somewhat legendary, with the small Botic being dubbed the grandfather of the Russian Navy. A man by the name of Feofan Prokopovich, who revised Peter's naval statute, is quoted to have said, "Who will not say that this small dinghy was to the fleet as the seed is to the tree? From that seed there grew this great, marvellous winged weapon-bearing tree." And in most regards this is true. This small English-built sailing boat sparked a lifelong obsession with the ocean, boats and all things maritime. And being the all-powerful Tsar, this led to Peter's push for the creation of the Russian Navy. To understand Peter as a person, you have to understand that in many ways he never fully grew up. He always had these obsessions that never left him even after childhood. Another lesser obsession, but one still crucial to understanding the personality of Peter, was his love of military organisation. As a child, Peter received a rather ad hoc education, spending more time in the armoury with craftsmen than with any tutor of religion or philosophy. This was all because of the tutor who was assigned to teach him, Nikita Zotov. Zotov was a church cleric, and was only really given the position as Peter's tutor simply because he knew the Bible well. However, Zotov soon began to widen Peter's learning and indulge the curiosities of the young prince. Once he had taught Peter how to read and write, there was little more Zotov had to teach him. He used to tell stories about war and battles to Peter, which sparked Peter's wish to go to war himself. Playing with his toy soldiers as a very young boy also grew his fascination with war and the military. It is not surprising, given what has already been said about his childhood obsessions and the way in which he learned, that it culminated in more real-world consequences. The following quote comes from a version of the Naval Statute, a series of essentially guides on how to run a navy, written by Peter and other naval experts, and encapsulates the point being made here excellently. But this monarch is so particularly remarkable in all he did that the very pastimes of his childhood are esteemed as transactions momentous and weighty and appear worthy to be recorded in history. Just as his obsession with sailing sparked the creation of the Russian Navy, his obsession with the military matters culminated in the creation of a more modern Russian army. As a child, Peter created what was known as Peter's Toy Army. Essentially him, fellow children and servants came together to play fight in small mock battles. This childhood group of around 100 children grew as Peter did. He ended up taking over the village of Preobrazhensky and later the village of Semyonovsky to house two entire regiments that took their names from their respective villages. They went from mock battles to becoming the most elite regiments in the Russian army, dressed in German blue and green uniforms, using German tactics, and essentially replacing the Streltsy as the core fighting force of Russia. It could be argued that had Peter not received the education he had from Nikita Zotov, that he would never have had the drive or the opportunity to indulge this hobby. The historian and author Lindsey Hughes, who wrote the book Russia in the Age of Peter the Great, which a great deal of information in this video comes from, argues that Zotov was wrong in giving Peter this education, that it did not prepare him for being Tsar. However, this is where I'm going to interject a bit of my own opinion. A mind such as Peter's would have been bored and wasted learning what traditional Tsars were meant to, religious texts and philosophy. Though these subjects had served the Tsars and rulers of Muscovy before them well, it was clear that by the time Peter was a boy, Russia needed something new. They had fallen behind most other European nations in science, culture and military matters. Zotov had allowed Peter to explore his natural curiosity and to learn skills that would serve him well in the future, such as artillery, shipbuilding, navigation, military maneuvering and more. It wasn't long before Peter's education in military matters was put to the test. From 1682 until 1689, Tsar Ivan and Tsar Peter had been under the control and supervision of their sister Sophia as regent. But it wasn't long before Peter could no longer stand being simply a figurehead, for Sophia was reluctant to relinquish power to Peter, who she had been trying to deny any sort of real position in government for years. This all came to a head in August of 1689, when Sophia's alleged lover Vasily Golitsyn, general of the Russian forces in the Crimean campaign during the Russo-Turkish War, and a key leading statesman in the Russian government, came back to Moscow from a disastrous defeat at the hands of the Tatars in Perekop. The issue arose when Golitsyn claimed that he had been victorious over the Tartars despite losing a third of their men simply from attrition, and failing to even begin a siege of the Tartar strongholds due to lack of supplies and preparation. It is thought that the reason Golitsyn claimed victory was in order to try and subdue the Moscow populace that had been rioting over the disastrous war that had caused starvation and disease in many parts of Russia. Peter saw Golitsyn and Sophia's claim of victory as an affront to Russia, a way to try and hold on to power and gain support, so he did not meet Golitsyn as he came back to Moscow. Peter then ordered the arrest of Shaklovets, the leader of the Streltsy, as he was encouraging Sophia to proclaim herself Tsarina in a final effort to hold on to power. Sophia told him to summon the Streltsy to move against Peter. Peter was then forced to escape at night to the Trinity monastery and had the play regiments meet him there, but when they arrived they found Peter on his bed weeping uncontrollably. We can be certain that the events transpiring around him had awoken traumatic memories of the Moscow uprising just 7 years ago in 1682, which further gives evidence showing just how impactful those events were upon Peter, potentially causing his epilepsy. Sophia went to meet Peter at the Trinity monastery, but was ordered to turn back under threat of execution. On September the 1st, Peter ordered Shalkovets arrested and Golitsyn to be exiled. Sophia then ordered Peter's courier, who had delivered these demands, to be executed, but no one in the Kremlin was willing to do it, further displaying how quickly Sophia was running out of power. The Streltsy then turned coat and sided with Peter after it was clear Sophia was losing this power struggle, and because if it came to a fight, the Streltsy would most likely lose, despite numbering 25,000 to Peter's toy regiments fielding a mere 10,000. They called for the arrest of Shaklovets, who was tortured and executed. Golitsyn surrendered and Sophia was arrested. Sophia was subsequently confined to the Novodevichy monastery, and Golitsyn was sentenced to death, but spared due to his high position and services he had given to previous Tsars. Instead, he was exiled to the Arctic. Childhood games brought mature triumph is inscribed on an engraving of a child Peter, and it is perhaps nowhere as true as it is here. This event was what cemented Peter as Tsar, and it is largely because of the military power he had created for himself. Had he not had the backing of his play regiments and their German tactics, modern weapons, and excellent discipline, then there would have been nothing stopping Sophia from crowning herself Tsarina and storming the Trinity monastery. Peter had therefore demonstrated his ingenuity from a young age. He was only 17 years old during these events, so before he was even an adult, he had feigns 2 coups, assembled a personal army, and gotten married to his first wife Eudoxia in January of 1689. All this may not sound out of the ordinary for many others during this time period. Charles XII of Sweden, who had become one of Peter's greatest enemies, was also faced with the prospect of governing a country and facing conflict at an early age, coming to power at just 15. However, it is clear that Peter had already distinguished himself and faced many psychologically damaging events. The record of Peter weeping on his bed in the monastery really shows the extent to which he was damaged, and this would have a lasting impact upon the person he was. Though Peter certainly became a more paranoid person, this didn't stop him from still pursuing his curiosities throughout his entire life. The most famous event that displayed Peter's natural curiosity was the Grand Embassy. This embassy was a retinue of 250 boyars, diplomats, civil servants, plus Peter himself, which travelled throughout most of Western Europe from 1697 to 1698. There were many goals for the embassy to achieve throughout its travels. The Russian government claimed that the main reason was to strengthen the Holy League that Russia was a member of against the Ottoman Empire. However, that was most likely not the reason for Peter's attendance. The goal of strengthening the League could have easily been achieved by the many skilled ambassadors that accompanied Peter. Peter was there for one thing: knowledge. Peter carried with him a seal with the words, "I am a student and I require teachers" written on it. Further evidence for this is the fact that he travelled incognito. He would don far less so elaborate clothing than his ambassadors and went by the pseudonym Peter Mikhailov. This, however, was rather redundant, as Peter was 6'8" in height, making him one of the tallest men in Europe and very, very distinctive. However, he tried to keep up the facade as he didn't care for all the formalities of court life and left that to his retinue. During the Grand Embassy, Peter visited a number of places: Rotterdam to study shipbuilding and sailing, London and Portsmouth to study navigation and metallurgy. He also visited Vienna in order to carry out the embassy's official mission of repairing the Holy League and convincing Austria not to make a separate peace with the Ottomans. However, this ended in failure. Peter had also intended to visit Venice for obvious reasons, however the Grand Embassy was cut short due to yet another Streltsy uprising. The expertise gained from the Grand Embassy would prove invaluable to Russia and to Peter's passion projects. It is believed anywhere between 70 to 600 specialists were recruited from Western Europe during the embassy to come back and work in Russia. Sources vary greatly upon the exact number, but it was certainly a significant amount, more than had ever been recruited at one time. Peter actually learnt hands-on experience. He worked in the Dutch dry dock, cutting wood, placing planks, learning through experience, not through books. It was in England where he learnt more about the theory of sailing, visiting the Royal Observatory and being taught by the very best in the world world about navigation. The fact that he saw himself as a student, not above those people who were teaching him, speaks true to his character. He cared little for the restraints of royal conventions placed upon him. He was simply there in his endless pursuit of knowledge. That leads us on to probably the most key part of Peter's personality. Peter was dogmatic. He controlled and regulated every part of Russian society and government, to the point where, when researching him, one could not help but wonder if he suffered from undiagnosed OCD or other such disorders, though it must be said that this is speculation, and there is no scientific backing for any such diagnosis, owing to the rather limited and almost non-existent psychiatry at the time. Examples of this behaviour include orders written by Peter to the Synod, noting that throughout Russia, state wax candles are to be made in such a fashion that every candle has a thickness at its base twice that at the top, and the upper thickness is half that of the lower. The length should be 5 times the thickness at the base. Peter also went to great lengths to make cemeteries more orderly. Any tombstone not at the right angle to the ground was unearthed and relaid, since stones which are untidy and improperly laid inflict ugliness on the holy churches and get in people's way. Peter's lust for regularity did not stop there. The entire city of St. Petersburg was itself a symbol of Peter's need for conformity, with its parallel streets, grids and canals. To quote historian Simon Sebag Montefiore in his book The Romanovs, Peter drove the creation of Petersburg by sheer will. No detail from public building to road grids was too small for him, and no one defecates except in the appointed places. Peter even ordered that a mock tent be set up for all market stalls to then copy the exact design of, in order to create a regulated and orderly market. The list of small minute details that Peter regulated and his hyperactivity throughout Russia goes on, with many referring to these ventures as Petrine Regularnost or Petrine Regularity. To end this section is a quote from a biography of Peter by historian E.V. Anisimov, who argues that a ship is the ideal symbol of his reign. Why a ship? I think that to Peter it was not only a means of transport for freight across the water's surface. The ship, Peter's eternal love, was for him a symbol of structure, organised and calculated to the inch, the material embodiment of human thought, complex movement by will of rational men. Furthermore, the ship for Peter was a peculiar model of the ideal society, the best form of organisation, relying on knowledge of the laws of nature in man's eternal struggle with the blind elements. The final, rather unique part of Peter's personality that is key to understanding him as a person links heavily to what has previously been said about how he in many ways never truly grew up. The All-Drunken Synod was a staple of Peter's reign, a group of his closest friends from all through the Russian government and military, most of whom were or had been in his play regiments, who regularly came together to have obscene drinking sessions. Dwarfs, giants, Nubians, and a whole host of what were considered oddities attended these sessions. The synod was originally set up as a sort of mockery of the actual synod or assembly during the time when Ivan was still alive, as Peter disliked the rigid structure of such institutions. An entire mock court was created from Peter's closest drinking buddies, with the synod taking place of the assembly. A mock patriarch was appointed in order to mock the real patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, Adrian, who was disliked by Peter due to his persecution of foreigners. Interestingly, the person chosen for this mock position was Nikita Zotov, Peter's old tutor and also the man who taught Peter much of what he knew about drinking. The mock court didn't stop there. They even had a mock Tsar, despite the real Tsar Peter being the focal point of the synod. Tsar Peter was given the role of archdeacon, and the mock Tsar, or Prince Caesar as it was known, was given to a man called Fyodor Irovich Romandanovsky. Romandanovsky was Peter's ruthless dirty man essentially, being one of the first generals in his toy army and becoming the head of the secret police, brutally suppressing the 1698 Streltsy uprising while Peter was in Europe during the Grand Embassy. The strange thing about the mock position of Prince Caesar was that Peter regularly kept up this charade. There were many examples of Peter fully committing to the mockery, even outside of drinking sessions, with Peter referring to Romandanovsky in correspondence as sire, or this quote from one letter congratulating the Prince Caesar on the birth of a male heir, referring to his baby as our sovereign Tsarevich and great Prince Ion Fyodorich. Essentially saying that Romandanovsky's child is the heir to the throne, as the Tsarevich was the title given to the Tsar's son and heir. This links heavily to what has previously been said about Peter's love of disguises, and on many occasions Peter would write to the mock Tsar as Peter the Woodworker, or Peter the Bombardier, or Peter the Admiral, refusing to be acknowledged as the Tsar. Although it may seem that this was all fun and games, a running joke per se, Romandanovsky's position came with some real power and responsibilities. He was granted his own court, which he could recruit and promote from, plus a government allowance, and on the many occasions when Peter was away, such as on the Grand Embassy or in Ukraine on campaign, Romandanovsky was act as a sort of figurehead in Peter's stead. As you can see, the All-Drunken Synod, though originally a mockery, became more and more influential, especially after the death of Peter's half-brother and co-Tsar Ivan V in 1696, when the official court that it mocked ceased to have any real power and was fully controlled by Peter. The actual exploits of the All-Drunken Synod are rather vague and badly documented, with Western scholars such as B.H. Summer, author of the book Peter the Great and the Emergence of Russia, referring simply to ghastly entertainments and disgusting ritual, and Lindsey Hughes, author of Russia in the Age of Peter the Great, simply referring it to as an enigma and still needing thorough examination. However, Soviet scholars who have implemented a great deal of revisionist history regarding Peter the Great in order to maintain Russia's glory have on many occasions defended the Synod, and one Soviet scholar wrote that the indecency was in keeping with the spirit of the times, so now it is difficult to bring oneself to describe them in detail, essentially saying that though we do not know the exact details, no matter what they did, others also did the same, which is a valid argument with plenty of evidence, probably the most famous being the many drunken sexual escapades of Charles II in England from 1661 to 1685. No matter what actually happened during many of these meetings of the Drunken Synod, the existence of the institution and other documented escapades of Peter and his synod, such as before Lent when Zotov led the assembly through the streets of Moscow on a carriage pulled by goats and pigs and bears, while his cardinals rode on donkeys and bulls, shows that a key part of Peter's personality was his love of satire, mockery, and merrymaking. To conclude this first chapter, I would like to simply sum up what has been displayed here. Through the examples given, I would hope that you have gained a rather sound idea of the kind of personality Peter was. Though there are certainly many other stories to tell, many other nuanced personality traits that could be looked at, I hope that the main pillars of his personality have been well portrayed here. Peter was a man of curiosity, a man of practicality, a man of obsession, and a man of regulation, a man of play and mockery, as well as a deeply disturbed and scarred man. All these character traits culminated in a truly fascinating man like no other ruler of Russia had ever seen, and in the next chapter I will show you how this character, with all his strengths and flaws, affected the country around him, how because of the nature of his personality he became involved in all aspects of Russian society, more so than any Tsar before him, and whether or not he truly deserves his mantle of Peter the Great. Peter's policies were very much the consequence of his personality and personal experience. Some argue that he was a calculated ruler who planned everything perfectly. Certainly many of the various policies, actions, and edicts he passed were overall and in hindsight great for Russia, and those are what he is remembered for. Actions such as the creation of St. Petersburg, the Russian Navy, modernizing the army, religious reforms, education reforms, the list goes on. However, these triumphs overshadow other failures, and they overshadow more of the selfish and sinister intentions behind his triumphs. This chapter will be in some ways the trial of Peter the Great. We have seen the kind of character that he is, and now it will be argued that he does not deserve his mantle and reputation in history because of how his bizarre and volatile personality affected Russia. Firstly, the Russian Navy, perhaps Peter's most proud and famous achievement. I have touched briefly upon this before, but now it is time to go into more depth on why the Russian Navy was perhaps not such an achievement as mainstream history portrays it. Now, it must be said that before Peter there was no Russian Navy to speak of. Ships and boats had certainly been used for military purposes before in Russia, but not with great effect. In 1668, the three-masted Eagle was finished and launched by Tsar Alexis and his Dutch shipwrights. However, as the ship was transferred to Astrakhan in order to explore and patrol the Caspian Sea, it was burnt by rebels in 1670. Peter's navy was therefore seen as the first proper Russian navy, as never before had the nation reached that level of organization, ship production, or sailing ability. Given the situation Russia's naval abilities had been in before Peter, it is no wonder that his navy had been hailed as such a success. For Peter, I built a fleet of 70 ships, steered by Muscovites who didn't even have a word to express the idea of a fleet in their language. It required such a vast amount of dedication, resources, planning, and execution to achieve. This dedication did culminate in a number of successes for Peter and Russia. The first success of the Russian Navy came in 1696, when the first Russian war fleet of 1,300 longboats, 4 fireships, and 22 galleys successfully made it to the Sea of Azov after the Ottoman fleet was forced to retreat due to successful Cossack raids. The Russian fleet then facilitated the capture of Fort Azov from Ottoman hands as they cut off the crucial Ottoman supply lines to the fort. But perhaps the most famous victory of the Petrine-era Russian Navy was the Battle of Hango, also known as the Battle of Gangut. This was the first victory for the Russian fleet over an opposing fleet. In 1714, during the Great Northern War against Sweden, the Russian fleet of over 70 galleys, reports differ from as few as 60 to as many as 98, out of the quite recently captured and built St. Petersburg, engaged a Swedish detachment of 1 pram, a kind of floating artillery barge, 6 galleys, and 2 skerry boats, small sailing dinghies equipped with light cannons. I do not want to get bogged down in the details of the movements and strategies in the battle, as they serve little purpose, but to quickly encapsulate the events, it was a Swedish massacre. Only around 23 Russian galleys could even engage the Swedish ships due to how outnumbered the Swedes were, and by the end, all the Swedish ships had been captured or destroyed. However, this battle was made out to be an enormous victory by both sides. Peter claimed it to be a much more equal battle than it actually was, stating in official documents that the Swedish pram had actually been an entire frigate, and the Swedish claimed that though they lost, they inflicted over 4,500 casualties on the Russian ships, despite the fact the entire Russian force numbered only 3,900, and less than half of them were even engaged in the battle. That is where the point being demonstrated here is highlighted. Peter's creation of the Russian Navy was not as great an achievement as it is remembered by history, largely because of Peter himself. This painting by French etcher Maurice Bocoy in 1724 is essentially a propaganda piece, as it shows the Swedish frigate that was never actually there. Hango is a shining example of the way in which Peter's greatness has been vastly overstated. Even today, the supposed heroic victory is celebrated by the Russian Navy. The first class of Russian dreadnought was called the Gangut class, celebrating a victory that was barely a battle. But the over-embellishment of the Petru Navy doesn't stop there. Peter's Navy really was just Peter's Navy. It was only functional as long as he compelled his subjects to maintain ships, train soldiers, and promote officers. The Russian historian and foreign minister of the Provisional Government of 1917, Pavel Milikov, puts it best. But even this project remained incomplete at the time of his death and was broken up into a series of scattered and unfinished attempts abandoned in part by Peter himself, in parts by his immediate successors. The paucity of the results compared with the magnitude of the wasted resources is especially striking. Well, in 1734, just years after his death, it was necessary to blockade Danzig from the sea, but the St. Petersburg Admiralty could provide at most 15 ships, and even these lacked crews and had no officers. This is a rather damning quote, and even more damning is what he said about blockading Danzig. A mere 9 years after Peter's death, and the Russian Navy had ceased to function. Despite Peter's many naval statutes he personally wrote instructing sailors and officers how to maintain a navy, it was no more than a facade that perpetuated a myth of greatness and glory that it had never even achieved. Modern Russian historian Enjevy Anisimov compared Peter's Navy to the Soviet space program, which is a rather fitting analogy. The fleet was, to quote Lindsey Hughes' book Russia in the Age of Peter the Great, as much for prestige as for practicality, and when comparing it to the Soviet space program, both generated a host of symbols above and beyond their immediate function, conveying the clear message that Russia was a major contender on the international stage, equipped with the means to conquer the worlds beyond their immediate frontiers. And finally, the most damning argument for why Peter does not deserve the credit he gets from history for his naval exploits was the cost, and I would like to again directly quote Lindsey Hughes' Russia in the Age of Peter the Great, as I don't believe I could put it any better than she has. Both attracted criticism for wasting public funds, on the grounds that much else, not least the living standards of ordinary Russians, was in desperate need of improvement. But it's no more credible to imagine that Peter would have renounced his navy in order to build more schools or improve nutrition of peasants than that the Soviet leaders of the 1950s to 1970s would abandon the space race in order to concentrate on public welfare. So as you can see, Peter's navy was not a sound policy. It was his own obsession, and that is what makes Russian history some of the saddest and yet most interesting history there is, because even after around 300 years of history, the same issues still plague Russian society, and still many of the working class suffer under tyrants, with all that has been changed is their labels. Given what has been established about Peter's personality as a dogmatic and obsessive person, this really isn't all surprising that Peter's obsession with the navy and his quest for glory caused so much unnecessary suffering and waste, and that he himself is guilty of creating a false narrative over his navy's achievements. Peter was a very military-minded person, and spent all but one of his 43-year reign at war, and so it is unsurprising that perhaps his second greatest achievement was reforming the army. However, just as with the navy, his terrible actions, embellishment of achievements, and the economic and human cost of the army are largely forgotten, or just simply ignored in order to maintain Peter's reputation as great. The Battle of Hango has long been hailed as a naval Poltava, which begs the question, what was Poltava? The Battle of Poltava was the decisive victory the Russians achieved over Charles XII of Sweden in 1709 during the Great Northern War, a war that, it must be noted, was started by Russia along with its ally the Kingdom of Denmark-Norway, and was hailed as the dawn of Russian power in Europe, and the beginning of the end of the Swedish Empire. Poltava, like Hango, was not in any way a fair fight. A Russian victory was essentially guaranteed from the start, owing to the fact that the Swedes had a mere 25,000 men compared to Peter's 40,000. However, many have argued that owing to the fact that the Swedish army was so professional, the Swedes could still have easily won, as it had been demonstrated early on in the Great Northern War in 1700 at the Siege of Narva that the Swedish army were more than capable of taking on a larger Russian force. At Narva, Peter fielded 40,000 troops, but was decisively beaten by Sweden's mere 9,000, and 8,000 Russians were slaughtered. However, Poltava was very different. No argument could be made here that the Swedish experience and preparation meant it was a more fair fight, as the Swedish army was on the verge of collapse by the time Peter actually engaged it at Poltava in Ukraine. Charles XII was injured and could not take command of the battle. He had just lost around 9,000 men to starvation and the bitter cold of the Russian winter, and those who were left were malnourished, frostbitten, and in no way fit to fight. To his credit, this was because of Peter's own strategy, and therefore credit may in fact be due. However, given that this strategy was a scorched earth campaign of vast amounts of his own country, causing the death and famine of countless thousands of his own people, perhaps it is clear that Peter cared more for military glory than the lives of his own subjects. Historian Lindsey Hughes makes a point in her book, Russia in the Age of Peter the Great, that many Soviet historians compared this action in a favourable manner to the similar orders of Stalin during the Great Patriotic War, and that it represents a heroic united struggle against a foreign invader. However, as Lindsey Hughes aptly points out, just as in Soviet Russia, the people of Peter's Russia had little choice in the matter and were forced to destroy their own food supplies and villages under threat of execution. Poltava resulted in the complete destruction of the Swedish army, with Charles XII fleeing to the Ottomans and the King's Guard being almost completely wiped out. To quote one eyewitness, the Russians destroyed the whole guard of King Charles, which was the heart and soul of the Swedish army. These old and splendidly trained soldiers were bombarded as though by a hail of iron. They fell before they could draw their weapons. One could again argue that Peter should be given great credit for this feat, as it was again Peter who spurred on the modernization and training of Russian artillery. However, it must also be noted the reason Peter's 102 artillery pieces could be used to such great effect on the Swedes was again due to the poor state of the Swedish army, not any genius on Peter's side. The Swedes did not deploy their own artillery, and the King's Guard was poorly commanded due to Charles's compromised position and the fact that the two Swedish generals, Renskold and Lowenthal, were in conflict with each other and failed to notify one another of the main battle plans. Clearly at Poltava, just as with Hango 5 years later, the battle was not the heroic victory that Peter made it out to be from his parades that occurred every year to commemorate the battle. It was clearly a victory and certainly showed the weakening of the Swedish Empire, but it was the very fact that the Swedish Empire was becoming weak that proves Poltava was not a sudden, unexpected victory against all odds that it is sometimes remembered as, despite Peter's best efforts to make it seem that way. In 1724, when planning that year's Poltava celebration, he asked for all the speeches being made about the battle to focus on our complete lack of experience in all matters. This may seem to contradict Peter's pride in his army. However, Peter's need to humiliate Sweden and to flatter his own image as nothing short of a godlike miracle worker trumped his pride of his army. Beside the military, Peter's most famous accomplishment was the founding and construction of St. Petersburg, which has already been touched on, but more depth is needed. The city was one of his greatest obsessions. It was to be the Venice of the North, the Paris of the North, the Jerusalem of the North, the new Rome, the new Constantinople, a completely new, planned city that was to be the center of art, science, and culture in the Western world, and one that contemporary historians have drawn parallels to Eden with, and Peter, its creator, as God. Peter fought for this city. He captured the land from the Swedish and was determined to hold on to it so dearly that he was prepared to give up all he had captured in Livonia, and he did give back all of Finland in the Treaty of Nystad in order to safeguard this one city. Undoubtedly, Peter did achieve his goal. He created a new westernized city, a new capital, a city that was like no other in Russia. Now, I would not be arguing that St. Petersburg was not as great as it seems, as that is far more down to opinion than anything else. I simply want to address the means by which it became a great city. Peter's personality directly affected the construction of St. Petersburg. His need for regularity created the gridded, organized city, however his instability also lent itself to its creation. Petersburg was built on slave labor, criminals, Swedish prisoners of war, and indentured serfs, who toiled in the icy waters of the Neva River constructing foundations, canals, bridges, and this entire new city. This new form of hard labor as punishment was known as katorga. Peter cracked down severely on those not carrying out their work. Whippings and knottings and executions were commonplace, but Peter tried to justify his actions. They call me a savage ruler and a tyrant. Who says this? People who do not know that many of my subjects place foul hindrances to carry out my best plans for the benefit of the fatherland, and therefore it is essential to treat them with great severity. Our people are like children. They never get down to learning their alphabet unless their her master forces them. These quotes come directly from Peter himself and show the kind of mindset he had. He did everything for the betterment of the fatherland, and though I've compared Peter's action to Soviet Russia before, I will do it again, as he shares the same mindset as Lenin and Stalin. He worked many of his people to death and justified it by claiming what he did was for the fatherland, but in reality it was to satisfy his own obsessions, his own goals, and his own ego. Of course, accounts vary on the exact number of serfs and prisoners who died during the construction of the city, but the generally agreed upon number is 30 to 100,000 out of the total 540,000 who worked on the city for the first 18 years. This has given the city yet another name, the City of Bones. Not only did common serfs suffer, but Peter caused upheaval amongst the richest, most elite in Russian society. Announced that people must go with their whole families, with everyone who lives in their same household with them, Peter declared. He was referring to thousands of nobles and wealthy families who inhabited Moscow, who would now have to move their entire households to St. Petersburg and build new houses there. It was reported that this forced move cost many households up to 2/3 of their entire wealth. One noble, Vasily Zmiev, a 70-year-old bedridden man who could no longer walk, claimed he would not be able to make the move and even sent a physician's note with proof to Peter, but Peter still ordered him to make the move and build a new house in Petersburg. But even this was controlled by Peter. In 1712, 1,000 of what he deemed the best families were ordered to build houses upriver from the Tsar's palace. 500 merchants and 500 traders were selected to build houses on the opposite bank, and 2,000 artisans were forced further along upriver. But Peter's quest for perfection was still not done. He wanted all these immigrants to become confident with the sea, and in 1710 fines were set up for any officials or officers who were caught crossing the river Neva using oars of their boats, which were also heavily regulated by Peter and had to match Western designs, instead of sails when there was enough wind. This truly was Peter's obsessive and dogmatic personality at its height, for he had put everything into this new capital city and he was determined for it not to fail, even if it cost the lives of thousands and the wealth of the nation. And the wealth of the nation was dwindling. Though tax revenue increased from 1.5 million rubles in 1680 to 3.6 million in 1701 and 8.7 million in 1724, this was largely because of Peter increasing taxes and introducing new ones such as a head tax to be paid per male instead of per household. And so Russia's newfound wealth was not entirely newfound. Even as tax revenue increased, so did Peter's ambitions with the army, navy, and St. Petersburg, constantly causing cash shortages in Russia. Friedrich Christian Weber, a Hanoverian who represented England at Peter's court in 1714, stated in his famous account, The Present State of Russia, "Russia is abounds in merchandise but not in ready money. The war has deprived the country of abundance of inhabitants, and those who are left labour under the oppression of the Tsar's officers, and of the nobility, to such a degree where they are quite disheartened from industry." Weber goes on to say that many nobles were putting their money into foreign banks, mostly in London as well as in Venice and Amsterdam, in order to avoid taxation by the state, and therefore depriving Russia of money that could have benefited everyone had it been in circulation. So it seems that not really much has changed in that regard. However, it must be said that Peter did do some good for the Russian industry, and excelled Russia's iron exports to the point where Russia was the world's leading exporter. However, this success didn't come until the later half of the 18th century, after Peter's death. Whether it was Peter's reforms, such as the creation of the mining college in 1719, that allowed this success. So historians have compared Peter's industrialization to that of the 5-year plans under Stalin. At the start of Peter's reign, Russia had a mere 24 factories, not factories in the same sense that we know them today, but by his death there were over 200. But comparing it to the Soviet industrialization of the 1930s is rather apt, as Peter's industrial leap also cost the lives of countless commoners. Even Stalin himself agrees with this analogy, as he said in a speech in 1928. Russia's backwardness was perceived as an evil even earlier, in the pre-revolutionary era and later, when Peter the Great, who had to deal with more developed countries in the West, feverishly built works and factories for supplying the army and strengthening the country's defences. This was the original attempt to leap out of the framework of backwardness. I hope I have shown that Peter did a great many shocking, terrible things that should have stripped away his title as great. But one final action that Peter took is probably the most damning example of why Peter doesn't come close to earning the distinguished place in history that he has been granted through ignorance: the torturing and killing of his own son and heir, Alexis. Alexis was Peter's first son and the only one to survive until adulthood. Alexis was from Peter's first wife, Eudoxia, who Peter had a bleak and cold relationship, resulting in most of her life being spent in a convent in Sudzil, after Peter denied the validity of their marriage. Peter's relationship with his son Alexis suffered from the same issues as that with Eudoxia, and because of the same reason. Eudoxia was a very conservative woman and cared little for the modern Russia Peter Peter was trying to create. As Peter was away on campaign so much, Alexis spent the vast amount of his childhood learning his core values from his mother. Alexis admitted to this himself during his trial in 1719. Having been brought up from infancy with a governess and her maids, from whom I learned nothing but amusements and diversions and bigotry, to which I had naturally an inclination. Alexis did have the same spark of intellectual curiosity that Peter had, with one foreign observer, Cornelius de Brun, stating in 1702, "The young heir treads already in the footsteps of his father, and gives great signs of understanding and genius." However, he, unlike Peter, received a more traditional and religious-based education, leading to perhaps Peter's worst nightmare, a boy just as intelligent and curious as himself, but with orthodox values that could potentially undo all that Peter had tried to do to westernize Russia. Alexis' relationship with Peter continued to decline as Peter treated him more and more like a government official than his son, despite Alexis also suffering from regular illness after a diagnosis of tuberculosis. Peter had him running errands for the war effort, inspecting garrisons, collecting recruits, and obtaining horses among many other duties, for which he got nothing but letters of disappointment and judgment from his father, which, knowing Peter's personality, is not all surprising. "I see that you are spending more time in idleness than taking care of business at this crucial time," Peter wrote to Alexis after he was disappointed in the quality of recruits his son had sent. This all came to a head in October of 1715, when Peter wrote that he would cut Alexis off like a gangrenous limb if he continued to fail to meet his duties and live up to Peter's expectations. Crucially, within a few days of this letter, Alexis' wife Charlotte gave birth to his son Peter, and Peter's second wife Catherine also gave birth to a son called Peter. This likely prompted Alexis' reply to Peter, in which he asked to be allowed to relinquish the throne. Peter gave him 6 months to decide if he truly wished to do this. A few months later, Peter then threatened Alexis with a new decision: take the throne or spend a life in a monastery. And so Alexis fled. Alexis wanted to live out his life away from the throne and away from his wife Charlotte, with his mistress Ephrosinia. The exact details of Alexis' hiding are unimportant to the point being made. However, I will say that he hid in Vienna and was forced to return to Peter when the Austrians refused his asylum due to fears it would cause a war with Russia. Peter brought back Alexis under the promise that he would be welcomed with open arms. However, when he got back to Russia, he was arrested and put on trial in order to seek out Alexis' accomplices, as Peter, with his paranoid and damaged mind, was fearful of yet another uprising against him. The events of his son's betrayal undoubtedly awoke memories of the 1682 Moscow uprising and the 1689 Streltsy revolt led by Sophia. Peter did face many more uprisings after these, but he was a grown adult when these occurred, and so they were less mentally damaging than the uprisings he had faced when he was just a child. In 1718, the Sudzil affair was a precursor to Alexis' own trial, in which Peter's first wife Eudoxia and a number of other political enemies were put on trial in order to try and link them to Alexis' supposed plot against Peter. All that came from this was the execution of Eudoxia's guard and lover Stepan Glebov for adultery. Alexis' trial, though originally meant to find accomplices, yielded little results, so Peter went after his own son. Interestingly, during the trial, we get a clear glimpse into Peter's world and what Peter held most dear to himself. Alexis' mistress, Ephrosinia, quoted words Alexis had allegedly spoken: "I shall bring back the old people and choose myself new ones according to my will. When I become sovereign, I shall live in Moscow and leave St. Petersburg simply as another town. I won't launch any ships, I will maintain troops only for defense, and I won't wage wars against anyone." Whether or not Alexis truly said these things or not is besides the point. Just this one quote shows you where Peter's priorities lay, and what his obsessions were, because in Peter's eyes, these were the most horrific things his son could do. The trial had begun on June 1718 when Alexis was moved to the Peter Paul fortress in St. Petersburg. He was first interrogated under torture on the 19th, and after 3 more sessions he was dead on the 26th. He was found guilty on the 24th and sentenced to execution, but died on the 26th due to exhaustion from well over 70 blows from the knout over 4 sessions, combined with his already frail frame. Once again, many contemporary historians couldn't help but compare these trials to the Soviet show trials of the late 1930s, especially after the Sudzil affair was given investigation in 1720 and 150 political enemies of Peter's were arrested. And though it may be seen by many as a cliche, there is merit behind these comparisons. Peter had a similar cunning and paranoia to Stalin. They both faced threats from those closest to them because of the way in which they tried to revolutionize Russia around them. The trials of Alexis itself was by all means a show trial. It was there as a warning and an excuse for Peter to grip harder onto power. Obviously they are not exact comparisons, the details are very different, but the core motive behind the trials was the same. Another argument could be made that Peter was right in killing his son to protect the progress he had made, and therefore this is not a good example of why Peter doesn't deserve his title. But that argument forgets a key point. Alexis didn't want the throne, he renounced it and was perfectly content in living a life of secluded luxury. The problem arose when Peter changed the ultimatum, and instead of a life of freedom, it was the throne or a monastery, and clearly Alexis wanted neither. The amount of detail into Peter's life and the Russia he ruled is enormous. There are so many other interesting events in Peter's life that could have been used to display the kind of person he was and the things that he did. The examples that have been used here are the most famous ones, and that is exactly why they were used, because these are the things he is most well known for and the things he gets credit for. Of course, there are so many other intricate details recorded about Peter's life that could have been drawn upon to show exactly why he was undeserving of his title. The way he treated his first wife Eudoxia has only been lightly touched upon. More could have been said about the religious reforms and his struggles against the clergy, his relationship with Catherine I, the Mons affair, his reputation as an antichrist amongst the ultra-orthodox priests, his criminal reforms, his seeming indifference to going from funeral to torture to wedding in one day, his many mistresses, the inspiration and admiration for Ivan the Terrible, his strange fascination with cutting open human bodies. The list goes on, and the details of these events could fill entire books by themselves. I hope what has been demonstrated here is the dangers of historical ignorance. Before researching this project, Peter the Great was simply a great Russian ruler to me, because he had to be. Why else would he be remembered as Peter the Great? But it is clear the reason he is remembered as great was because of his own ego and how he sought to preserve his image in Russia. I have made comparisons to Stalin many times in this video, so one more should not hurt. In much of modern Russia, Stalin is still remembered as a hero for the role he played in winning the Great Patriotic War and defeating Nazism, just as Peter is remembered as a hero for defeating Sweden and making Russia a major power for the first time in history. But the issue with these historical perceptions, and the reason it is so hard to get rid of these biases, is because of the truths that lie inside them. It is true that Stalin saved Russia from defeat in the 1940s, and it is true Peter did change Russia arguably for the better over the course of his reign, but it seems these truths obscure other more telling ones. They ignore the means and context by which these more simple and therefore memorable historical accomplishments were achieved. But where Stalin's image and most of the rest of the world is now completely associated with the unimaginable amount of cruelty and suffering he inflicted on his people, Peter's image is still largely glorified, and that is because he is arguably not as relevant to the modern age as Stalin, and therefore less attention is paid to him. And that is an issue when history forgets the details and simply repeats the mainstream position on historical figures and events. And unless an event or a figure is suddenly contentious in the modern world, or is universally famous, little is known about them past their most superficial achievements. Many judge Peter by the context of his time and excuse his actions because of it, but I hope that I have demonstrated here that even by the context of his time, he was still a tyrant. I have made comparisons to later figures like Stalin and Lenin, but now I want to make a comparison to an earlier figure, and one that Peter himself admitted to taking inspiration from: Ivan the Terrible. Ivan ruled the Grand Duchy of Moscow from 1533 to 1547, and then he formed Russia and proclaimed himself the first Tsar until his death in 1584, though he was not a Romanov Tsar. There is a great deal of similarities between Peter and Ivan. Both killed their sons in horrific ways, both brought great amounts of reform to Russia, both caused the suffering of a great number of their people, and both fought great numbers of uprisings and rebellions in order to maintain their dreams for a new Russia, and both are thought to have been mentally unstable. Ivan the Terrible is the answer to the counter-argument to this video, the argument that Peter did not do anything out of the ordinary for a ruler of that era, and this is arguably true. Ivan the Terrible is evidence for that. He did things just as good as Peter and just as bad as Peter. However, his legacy has been impacted justly. He's remembered as the Terrible, and yes, I know that this was originally a bad translation, and in fact he was originally meant to be terrible in a positive way in the original Russian. However, through modern interpretation, the title of Terrible has come to literally mean terrible in the negative way, and it is my opinion that he by all means deserves this. And yet Peter is still the Great, despite carrying out similar actions and even taking inspiration from Ivan himself. So yes, it is true that other rulers did similar things, but they are justly remembered in a negative light for those actions, where in stark contrast, Peter still gets praise. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Much of the information and inspiration came from two books in particular: The Romanovs by Simon Sebag Montefiore and Russia in the Age of Peter the Great by Lindsey Hughes. Both books are excellent reads and provide a vast amount of information on the topics looked at in this video, and I highly recommend reading them and other works in different areas of Russian history by these two amazing authors.